Hi there, I'm Nina Goradia, and I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner. Today, I'm here with my friend Santosh Kumar, and we are going to talk about collective trauma and the impact on the individual. Santosh is a wealth of information on this subject, and I'd like for him to introduce himself and where he has some of this trauma background from, and then he's going to launch us into this discussion of collective trauma, and it's really going to be fascinating.
So thank you for having me here, Nina. It's a privilege and it's a pleasure to be talking about collective trauma. I heard about collective trauma about 2 years ago when I chanced upon the work of this amazing mystic and spiritual healer. His name is Thomas Ubel. Yeah. And he's done amazing amount of work in Israel and in Germany. Because he's realized these societies have not really moved forward because of a density, a very difficult to pin down density that has shrouded the entire atmosphere of these countries. And this density is felt within the bodies of people who live in these countries. And that's how, as a mystic, he actually blossomed into the role of healing collective trauma. And I find this ties very beautifully to the work that you do at the individual level, because what you do individually with the nervous system of an individual and the presence that you build up within an individual, he does that actually collectively with the nervous systems of everyone, supporting the nervous systems of everyone who is in that space, and the collective presence of everyone who comes into a healing collective space that's supporting the healing of every individual. There's this beautiful saying that I think a lot of us might know. It's a cliche that the whole is much greater than the sum of its individual parts. And that's where I feel there's beauty in the work that you do individually and that the work he does collectively, with the density of the trauma in societies that are still reeling from the shock of, let's say, the genocide of Jews in the past, or the shock or the trauma of colonialism or industrial revolution. So this is where, I began I was very interested and deeply devoted into the principles of conscious healing by Thomas Ubel. I can share a bit more about what happens in a healing session later.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting to hear.
Absolutely. So what happens, right? Like there are basically 5 principles of conscious healing by this profound mystic Thomas Ubel. And the first step is really presence. It's about building this individual presence. So there is a series of centering and grounding exercises. People come together in a space with an intention to heal not just our individual traumas, but the collective trauma that inhibits us and that prevents us from progressing forward. And so what does happen is centering and grounding exercises that builds up individual presence, but beyond that, there is a collective presence. And one does this collective presence, and you can almost feel it. It's this very nice sense of presence that you feel. It's loving presence, the same way you feel this loving presence of your grandmother when you're in the presence and you sit on the lap of your grandmother. This presence builds up. Second principle is then deeper attunement. You know, the kind of a deep attunement is really a deep connection where I can be very raw and vulnerable with you. And I don't need to put on a mask and say something that's not me. Yeah, that's deep attunement. Like I say things as they are, as it's happening in me. That's deep connection attunement. And then once that happens, we go into a subtle capacity or a deeper perception that builds coherence within everyone. There dawns a level of coherence and resonance. I feel you. I can connect to you. I can almost feel like what you're going through. I can I can tap into your pain. I can tap into your joy. There's this deep connection. And you know, in the principle of Ubuntu, I am because we are, this becomes very lived and experienced. My identity is a result of everyone's identity. And when this happens, right, the barriers and the boundaries between people start to break, and there dawns a collective intelligence and presence. And all of us receive downloads of healing and of messages for the future of humanity to progress forward. So that's basically what happens in a collective trauma healing session with Thomas Hubel. And it's a deep, deep work that happens.
Amazing. Yeah, I encourage people to follow up on Thomas Hubel's work if they're interested in this. Thank you so much for that introduction about his work and collective trauma. Now, you and I have had some conversations before about collective trauma that I found to be so fascinating, and especially on its impact on the individual. And you had shared with me this story about an Indigenous tribe and how they treat people who get sick. Would you mind sharing that? And maybe we could launch into the individual's impact from collective trauma.
In the spirit of like the modern civilization, when someone gets sick, you tend to put that person out. That person is disposable. It's like you don't want to see the person, and you put them in a hospital, and hospitals are places, or hospices are places where sick people go to, right? Out of sight, out of mind. That's what we do with people who are sick within our community or in our village. Whereas in the indigenous tribes, what happens is when someone falls sick, the tribe gathers around in a circle around the person who is sick, either physically or mentally. And instead of throwing that person out into a hospital out of sight, they actually express deep gratitude for the person's presence. And what they say is, we thank you for being the vessel and the vehicle to reflect to us a deeper wound that exists within the collective or the structures that we operate in. You are a messenger for something that is subtler, that's going on, that is causing the sickness. Yeah. So if we tap into your sickness, there is a message to be unveiled, which promotes a deeper healing within the community that everyone actually has been complicit in. We were all complicit and co-conspirators in the perpetuation of a certain disease that manifested within that one person. So that's the way in which they view that. Now, this also has got implications, not only in the medical field, but also in the transformative justice field. Our form of justice is it's quite punitive. It's not restorative, and it's not transformative. And what happens is, now this is very beautiful again in indigenous tribes. When, let's say, one member of a tribe steals from another member of the tribe, they don't punish the person who stole. They don't punish the thief or the robber. Instead, again, in the same spirit of a person who's diseased, they circle around the person who stole, and they go through a journey of introspection and contemplation in asking themselves, how did we allow this to happen? How did we operate? How did we operate to an extent where one member of our tribe had a sense of scarcity for which he or she had to compensate through an act of stealing? If we can heal the underlying structures and systems that generated the scarcity and promote a spirit of abundance, then there'll be no one person who feels lack and who want to compensate or address the lack by stealing anymore. So those are more sophisticated, more nuanced ways of approaching disease in a community or in a tribe, or an act of crime in a tribe.
I really love that. I'm so moved by these stories, and it just brings up so many questions. But first, I want to mention to people that, in this society where there's not a recognition of, how collective trauma impacts the individual, I think a lot of individuals are just simply blaming themselves that, they should have been able to manage everything thrown at them and never mess up and not be impacted by it or traumatized by it. And so I just want to really highlight that there are these larger influences that are impacting us, many of which we're not even aware of, so many variables that are out of our control, and we are impacted by them. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't do anything about it or don't try to heal, but I want to just caution against this added blame that is not necessary, but we can start to really look like, what are the variables that impacted me, and how can I work with these? But simply blaming oneself for all of one's problems doesn't really solve the issue, nor is it accurate. Oftentimes it can serve as an obstacle for the healing, in fact, because it's just kind of slapping this, okay, here's the answer, it's my fault. But that doesn't do anything about the issue. We want to really deeply look into it in as non-judgmental of a way as possible, as curious a way as possible. Like, okay, these were the factors that caused this happen. Okay, so I can do this next time. So I just wanted to encourage this deep, honest exploration, that we take accountability for our stuff, and then we also notice when it wasn't our stuff, but we were still impacted. So thanks, Santosh. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for adding clarity. And yeah, I love what you just mentioned, because in Thomas Hubel's book, you can check it out, Healing Collective Trauma, he talks about intergenerational trauma and cultural trauma. And so there is transmission of trauma from our ancestors and people who live in our land, and we become vehicles for the trauma. Yeah. Now, there's this
Yes.
beautiful saying, we do not see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. It's the lenses through which we view the world that color our perception of what the world is. And then we project our perceptions on the reality. And
Absolutely.
this is why, as you mentioned, we need to come together in a spirit of deep humility and reverence and openness to suspend our judgments, our prejudices, and our assumptions about a particular situation, and to just sit with the issue at hand, and to do collective witnessing and collective presencing. Yeah. Now, this brings me to a beautiful parable that I will like to share. It's a beautiful parable which is called The Story of the Fifth Monk by John McCallan. And I'm going to put the link somewhere, and I'll share the link with you. Yeah, I can even share my screen just to share the source from which this came from. But it's really about digging deeper into the root causes of the problems that we're dealing with. And a lot of us are just treating the problems in our society, disease, criminal act, at the layer of symptoms, but not at the root causes. And this parable of the fifth monk is a very beautiful parable that illustrates the different levels at which we can examine. And it's saying, if we come together in the spirit of humility and reverence, therein dawns a collective intelligence that's far bigger than the sum of the individual intelligences that gives us the answers that we've been looking for, that's eluded us. Yeah, I think a lot of us would probably be familiar with this story of the 5 blind men and the elephant. I think we grew up with this beautiful story.
But feel free to share it if you'd like, because I think there could be many people who haven't come across it.
Absolutely. So there's this idea, it's the elephant is really the problem of the issue at hand. It's the elephant in the room, for example.
Yeah.
Right. There are 5 blind men, so 5 blind people who are touching different parts of the elephant. One person who touches the tusk says, "This is a stick." Another person who touches the tail, this is a rope. The person who touches the leg of the elephant says this is a tree trunk. So there is what you touch, which is, sense perception coming in, modulated and screened through the lens of perception, which is colored and tinted. And then we interpret the event. There is an inference. Yeah, there is a lot of meaning that's lost in translation. And it's only when we come together and admit that we are all blind. That's the more we know we don't know. And we need to suspend our individual judgments about the elephant, where we can piece together from the rope to the tree trunk to the stick to an entire whole elephant that is very different from the sum of the individual parts that I described to you. So it transcends even the sum of the tree trunk, the stick, as well as the rope. It's beyond that. The reality is deeper and far different from what we conceive or perceive it to be. There is a wonderful person in the US who some of you might be familiar with. His name is Otto Scharmer. He's part of the MIT's Presencing Institute, and he created a theory called Theory U, which applies these deeper spiritual principles of healing collective trauma, the story of the fifth monk, and the story of the five blind men and the elephant in societal change. So I would invite the viewers to look into the work of Otto Scharmer, the founder of the Presencing Institute at MIT, and the author of Theory U.
Wonderful. Yeah, and then do you mind also sharing with us the story of the fifth monk?
Absolutely. So now the story of the fifth monk is a very long story. Do you think I can share my screen and share the summary of the story of
yeah, that'd be great.
So I hope everyone who's tuning into this recording, you can go to tomcallanan.com. So this is the website where I got the story of the fifth monk. And you can just search for the story of the fifth monk. So basically you've got 5 monks, right? But the story starts with just 4 monks. And you can just look at this. It's basically about rescuing babies and going upstream in framing what the problem is. But I'm going to scroll through the story because that's not the essence of the story. The essence of the story is reflected in this table, which you can see. And I'm just going to zoom into the table. And basically, there are 5 levels in which we can look at philanthropy or solving problems in a society. If you just look at the first monk, which was rescuing babies from a river, this is in the medical model, it's just first aid. It's addressing the symptoms of the problem. So if there is a disaster in a country, you would just render first aid. So that's saving or preserving life with immediate action. That's the first level with which we would respond to a crisis. And that's the first monk. Whereas if you want to have an elevated consciousness to study the problem, and this is babies who were flowing down a river, what the monk did, the second monk, he went upstream to build an orphanage to prevent more babies from flowing down the river. So this is addressing the symptoms of the disease with a direct and powerful intervention. The third monk goes even beyond that to establish a family planning program. And this is prevention is better than cure. The idea in medical, the medical model, disabling the presenting causes of the disease. So preventing more babies from being born. And then the fourth monk builds a coalition for social change. And that's what we call holistic healing, which is changing habits and lifestyles to strengthen and build the whole system to optimal health. Now, the fifth monk is even deeper than that. It's convening gatherings and creating projects aimed at individual and social transformation, which is transformational healing, which is to change the consciousness. The way in which we perceive the problem is the problem itself, which comprises our worldview, the beliefs, the metaphors, and the myths which helps us to transcend to a new level of wholeness and integration. So this is the highest level, which is the most upstream or the root cause of problem solving. So I invite you to go to this website to read the entire story. The other part of the story that's worth mentioning, and I shan't go any further, is this part about Elizabeth Saturi's words about caterpillars. What she says is very profound. There is nothing in a caterpillar that tells you that it came from, that it will go into a butterfly. There is nothing in a butterfly that tells you that it came from a caterpillar as well. And so what it's trying to say is that when we're looking at healing collective trauma, there is the dawn of a new butterfly that is very different from the individual caterpillars, which is the new metamorphosized reality from which we can operate from. It requires us to transcend all the past notions and judgments and prejudices to come to this elevated level of a butterfly, which is very different from the initial stage of a caterpillar. So this is where I'll end the story. I'll invite the viewers to go to Tom Callinan's website to read this story. I'll stop sharing screen here.
Yeah, thank you so much. That just reminds me of the saying how we cannot change a problem at the same level of consciousness that it arose from. So collectively, if we apply that, you know, we can start to collectively heal. That was my takeaway from the caterpillar part, but that was a beautiful sharing around the different levels that we need to go to deeper understanding of collective trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For those who are interested in systems thinking, there is a wonderful person called Donella Meadows, who is a very prominent systems thinker. She's got this thing, you can Google this, the 12 interventions of a system, or the 12 leverage points of a system. The points where you gain the most leverage in transforming a system is where you transcend, you examine and you transcend your existing paradigms. Paradigms are the lenses through which we view reality and we perceive and we interpret reality. If we just take off the lenses and we see a different thing, that's the highest point of leverage for a systems transformation. And all of that is very valuable for healing collective trauma.
Amazing, wonderful. I think doing our individual work is helping the collective, and then being aware of the systems as well can start to help the individual. So I was really benefited from this talk today, Santosh. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
If there's one thing that I learned, it goes back to this same principle. The more I know I don't know. And we do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. All of us are bathed in an invisible and very transparent culture of trauma. Fish does not know that water exists. Fish, which is, yeah. And what we are calling for in systems thinking and in ontological coaching is called a break in transparency. The culture that we live in is so transparent. This lens is so transparent that you can't even see the culture that we are all bathed in. And that's why we need to be very careful when we have certain prejudices or judgments. It calls for deep humility and openness to looking at something from a very different lens.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Santosh, I apologize. I forgot to ask you to mention your background with our viewers today, because you have a background in systems thinking, right? Which makes this so much more amazing hearing about collective trauma from you. Do you mind just sharing with us your background?
Absolutely. So I'm a coach and a consultant for individuals as well as teams and organizations and systems at large in societies. I had a background in the Economic Development Board of Singapore, where I looked at strategic planning of the entire country's economic development. And over time, as I struggled dealing with the symptoms of the problems we were dealing with, that we were facing, I realized that we were not addressing the root causes. And there was something a lot more that was going on within an invisible culture that we were all bathed in that I was trying to examine, and that was culture. So while I was doing work at the level of execution and strategy, I found the real lever was culture, mindsets. So with that, I changed the focus of my work from the Economic Development Board of Singapore, where I spent 5 years, to doing more culture healing work, where I was addressing socioeconomic inequalities and social divides in Singapore. So racial divides, religious divides, economic divides, and many other forms of divide, political divides in Singapore society, where we are very fragmented. And in healing these divisions in society, I looked at healing the underlying culture that we were all bathed in. And as I went deeper into what are the best ways of healing culture and mindsets in a society, I went to the work of Thomas Hubel, which was trauma, collective trauma. I realized there was a density of trauma that we were all bathed in, that despite our best intentions, was actually preventing us from doing our best work. You can have the best of intentions, but if you're not trauma informed at the collective level or at the individual level, you will not be able to effect deep systemic shift in a society. So that's where, trauma-informed community development came about in Singapore, where we are looking at trauma-informed practices for both individual healing as well as collective healing. Because Singapore, a lot of the problems that we face as a society has its roots in our colonial past, in the Industrial Revolution, in a growth and development that was very economic, and in the urbanization of Singapore. So there was a lot of intergenerational trauma that was transmitted that prevented a lot of us who were looking at systems change in our society from doing the deep work. And unless we convene gatherings of people together to introspect and contemplate deeply into what's happening, we would not be able to shift the system.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much, Santosh, for sharing your background and your wealth of information with us. I'm sure many have benefited. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Nina.